First up, Boston Globe columnist Kevin Cullen was put on administrative leave last Friday following accusations by WEEI's Kirk Callahan that his columns on the Boston Marathon bombings contained fabrications. Globe editor Brian McGrory posted an editor's note simply saying the results of an investigation would be made public. But nothing further has been written in the paper, even while Kirk and Callahan continue battering away at Cullen. If you are a sports radio fan, you got a hefty dose of something other than sports on Kirk and Callahan this week. A barrage of criticism of the Boston Globe's Kevin Cullen.
Cullen made stuff up and tried to insert himself and use the Richard family.
For 2 weeks now, Kirk Minahan has led the charge, accusing Cullen of misleading readers about his whereabouts on Marathon Day and fabricating stories about first responders.
The Sean O'Brien story where O'Brien, told him, and then Cullen cried in front of him, never happened. Never, ever, ever, ever happened. Ever.
But there's also been a nasty edge to the criticism, with Kirk and Callahan taunting Cullen and taking glee in his potential downfall.
The beauty of it is his life is over.
In the past, such nastiness would have prompted a Globe response.
We can't be quiet anymore. This stuff keeps happening on the radio, and people think it's okay. It's not okay.
Just a few months ago, the Globe's Shirley Leung was calling out WEEI's advertisers, asking if they wanted to be part of a station that mocks Chinese accents and demeans women.
I started contacting advertisers. Then I said, hey, do you know this show just last week had a host mock an Asian American on air?
But the Globe has been silent on the whole matter of Cullen and WEEI. No news stories, no columnists weighing in. Nothing save this vague editor's note. In a memo to staff, McGrory explained the investigation will be two-pronged and will be conducted by 3 local journalists, including BU Dean of Communications, Tom Fiedler. And, of course, Tom Fiedler regularly appears on the show, and he'll have to recuse himself probably for the next couple weeks or a month or so until the investigation is complete. So while I understand why the Boston Globe doesn't want to give credit to Kirk and Callahan, I think they did themselves a disservice by not doing that in the original editor's note, because if you don't listen to sports radio, if you don't listen to Kirk and Callahan, and you read simply that editor's note, you would have no idea what this is about whatsoever. I talked to a prominent journalist a couple days ago and asked him what he thought of the whole thing. He said he didn't know what I was talking about because he wasn't plugged into the whole sports radio scene. I don't know for a fact, but it seems to me that there's some kind of a moratorium or a dictum that nobody write about this, because even just a news article kind of putting everything in context about what's being investigated, that happened during the Mike Barnicle investigation, during the Patricia Smith investigation, and others that have come up. Even when there was an editor's note about that wrong information about the Zantop murderers, remember that from 15 years ago or something? They explained the process to a point. This note that McGrory sent out to staff was internal, and the names of the people conducting the probe have been made public, but it hasn't been made public to the general readership.
Look, I think, from your piece there, it's a little different with what Shirley was doing. Anytime there's an issue where someone's speaking negatively about people because of a race or religious reasons or whatever it may be, it's easier to just come out and talk about it, because advertisers they're nervous to touch anything that might be toxic of that nature. And so I think you can be very comfortable in coming out and speaking out against something like that.
Except, let me just interject, some of the tone of the coverage from Kirk and Callahan has been so ugly that you might think somebody would bring that up.
Right, more like a personal vendetta.
Right, yeah. It does seem that. And I think, look, I do think that it is true that she did come out and people were more forceful in denouncing that kind of coverage. What I will say is, whenever you have an organization that's quiet on an issue that's controversial, the longer you do that, what it allows is for people to start speculating about what's going on. If you don't come out, if you don't put information out there, then that rumor mill just really heats up. And I think it can end up pulling down an organization, a company. Other reporters can be sullied by it, whatever it may be. That's the problem I have with this. Come out, put information out there, and at least fill that vacuum so that other people can't make more things up and those things can't catch like wildfire.
I want to echo and I think shift a little bit from something that you just said, Dan. I agree that it's very different what Shirley Leung was doing when she was calling out the way I was talking about, was it Don Yee, is that Brady's agent?
Yeah.
In that case, Shirley Leung was the media critic. In this case, Kirk Minahan is the media critic. So I don't know that there's a precedent for the Globe calling out EEI when EEI is taking the Globe to task for doing things that they shouldn't have done. I totally agree with you about the editor's note. I tweeted the day that that came out. If I had written this note, I would have noted that the questions were raised by WEEI. They could also have mentioned Kirk Minahan specifically, but certainly mentioned by EEI, and then say what the questions are, because if you read that note, you have no clue what the questions were. And as for the tone of the coverage, I find it hard to listen to, too. That, you know, what was the bite that you used in the package? You know, the good news is basically his life is over. There is a bloodlust that you can hear there, but I'm a big believer that it doesn't really matter what people's agenda is if they're right on the facts. And for the most part so far, Kirk Minahan's been right on the facts.
Well, I agree completely with Dan and Adam. I do think that editor's note should have made mention of the fact that WEEI had reported this story. Transparency is a wonderful thing, and we really haven't seen a lot of it with this. At first, I thought the results might come in a few days, so there wasn't really necessarily any need to do an additional story on it. But now it looks like this could go on for a while. I think the Globe ought to do a story telling us what was going on. I would also point out that when some of the similar situations happened years ago, the Globe had an ombudsman, and the ombudsman, the reader representative, would do reporting on these kinds of internal situations. The Globe no longer has one. I should say hardly anybody does anymore, but the Globe is among them.
I worked for the Globe in '98 when Patricia Smith resigned and when Mike Barnicle resigned. And there is a big difference in just the way the industry is. Or was then compared to the way it is now. The lack of an ombudsman is a big deal. The fact that there is social media and it's much easier for people to speculate about this and to gin up that rumor mill that is the danger that could grow in the silence. That wasn't a problem in '98. The Globe's word on it in defense of themselves, in defense of what they were doing, in defense or to persecute their employees, all of that was there's their story to tell. Maybe another outlet, maybe the Herald would have a follow-up, but they could control the narrative. Nowadays, you can't control the narrative, and in that silence, they're letting go of any ability that they had to, at the very least, tell the readers their side of their story.
By the way, I didn't mean to equate the two. I'm sorry if you got that impression, but I just think that Shirley Leung, who's been on this story, would be a likely person to be on this, and that's what I'm saying. That, you know, she was all over that when there was a controversy with Don Yee and with Alex Reamer calling out the Brady's child. So she would be a natural. Yeah, she's been on the beat.
We should probably mention that according to that McGrory memo, pardon me, I guess I'm ready for dinner, apparently. According to that McGrory memo, there's going to be two phases to this review. We've got Tom Fiedler and Kathleen Carroll, who used to be the AP's executive editor, looking at Cullen's marathon-related coverage, specifically getting help from Dan Okrent, the former New York Times public editor, as necessary. And if I recall correctly, there's going to be an in-house review of Cullen's broader body of work.
Which is in line with what they did back 20 years ago in other incidents. So that having the internal investigation isn't out of the ordinary.
We did ask the Globe, by the way, why they hadn't written about this, and didn't get a response on that question. So.